And in this module, we're going to see how to perform some work on the client side in the browser with ASP.NET MVC and Visual Studio. I want to show you how to manage your client-side libraries like jQuery and Bootstrap. We'll also talk about bundling these client-side assets to get those files to your customers as quickly as possible. And we're going to see how to enable and configure client-side validation in the application. I will also walk you through the single-page application template provided by ASP.NET MVC. But before we can build a single-page application, we need to learn a bit more about how to manage client-side libraries. Over in Visual Studio, when we created our application, there were already a number of client-side libraries pre-installed into this project template. Let's open up the scripts folder and take a look. It's inside of here where I can see we're already using jQuery, and there's several different distributions of jQuery here. Generally, a JavaScript file with a .min in the name, min, means this file has been minified, so it's been crunched down to be as small as possible. When you run JavaScript code through a minifier, the minifier is going to remove all the white space and even rename local variables so that the variable names are as short as possible. And that's why jQuery, this file, if we browse through the source code, it's somewhat readable. There's a lot of source code here, but it is readable. There's white space, there's formatting. If we open up the minified version of jQuery, this file is going to be very difficult to read, because first of all of the unneeded white space characters have been removed, so we don't even have line breaks. But on the other hand, if we send this file down to the client, it's going to be a lot smaller, so it's going to get processed a lot quicker. So we have several versions or distributions of jQuery. We're also using Jquery Validation. That's already installed. That's a plugin for jQuery that enables some client-side validation features, which we're going to take advantage of here in this module. There's also Bootstrap, which consists of a CSS file, because Bootstrap is a CSS framework, but Bootstrap does come with some interactive components like a picture carousel that will keep rotating pictures through a page. And those interactive components require JavaScript. Therefore, we have bootstrap.js and bootstrap.minified.js in the scripts folder. And then there's also a library called Modernizer. If you support customers who are using some of the older browsers out there like Internet Explorer 9 or even Internet Explorer 6, then Modernizer is a JavaScript library you want to look at and take advantage of. The goal of Modernizer is to modernize those older browsers, so add some features into those browsers using JavaScript that otherwise would not be supported. If you do a search for Modernizer on the internet, I'm sure you will find the documentation that you need to take advantage of that library. But now the question you might have is, how do I manage these libraries? What if there is a newer version of jQuery that I want to take advantage of? Well, with ASP.NET MVC and Visual Studio in general, there's been a few different approaches that you can use to manage client-side libraries like Bootstrap and jQuery and Modernizer. One approach is to simply go out to the official sites for these particular frameworks and click on a download button to download and then manually copy these files into the scripts folder, or perhaps into your content folder. That's where we will find the Bootstrap CSS files. So you download and then copy the files that you need into the project. That's one possible approach. Another approach that we've used in the past with ASP.NET is to manage client-side libraries through Nuget packages. So if I go in and say I want to manage Nuget packages, I can do a search for something like jQuery, and I will find that I do have the ability to install a jQuery package. And this will place the JavaScript files that I need into my project. This is another viable approach for you. But I will say that over the last couple of years, there's been a shift away from using Nuget for client-side assets like cascading style sheets and JavaScript files. Instead, we've been trying to restrict Nuget to just working with .NET assets. So how do I obtain a library or a framework like the Entity Framework? Well, I can install that piece of software as a Nuget package. How do I obtain something like jQuery or Bootstrap or Angular? Well, for these client-side assets, perhaps I should use something that's been optimized for that client-side environment, because Nuget was really optimized for .NET. So what can you use for client-side package management? Well, there is NPM, the tool that is associated with Node.js, the Node Package Manager. I'm not going to show you how to do that in this course. I do show you how to do that in my ASP.NET Core course. NPM is a relatively simple tool, but if you'd like to just stick with using Visual Studio, there is a way to manage these client-side assets officially through Visual Studio. So if I right-click on odefoo.web and say that I want to manage client-side libraries, or even better, if I click and say that I want to add and then select Client-Side Library. Visual Studio now has the capability to go out and search and download client-side libraries and frameworks that I want. So for example, if I wanted to look for jQuery because I didn't have it in this project already, or I wanted to update to the latest version, then Visual Studio can go out and say, hey, I found jQuery version 3.4.1. It's on a provider named CDN.js, and you can see there's several different providers here that Visual Studio can use to download that particular library. And I can also select specific files that I want to download. So if I just want to download jQuery and not the minified version, or I want to download just the minified version, I can do that, but we can include all library files. I can also specify different version numbers here. And once I click Install, Visual Studio will not only download all of the files that I specified and place them into the lib folder, it will also maintain a record of what has been installed. So if we look through this project, we will find there is a new file here, which is librarymanager.json, libman.json. This file describes to Visual Studio what I have installed. So I have the library jQuery version 3.4.1 installed from CDN.js. Whenever you update or download this particular library, place it into the lib jQuery folder. So now moving forward, what I can do when I check this project into source control, I just need to make sure that libman.json is checked into source control. I don't necessarily need to check in the lib folder because Visual Studio can recreate that folder using the information that is in this JSON file. Just like I don't need to keep around Nuget packages if I have a packages.config file that tells Visual Studio what packages I have installed. And now in the future, if I see there's a new version of jQuery that is available, let's say version 3.5, and I want to test out that version to see if everything is still compatible and working, I can simply change the version number in here, save this file, have Visual Studio go out and fetch those new files, download them into the lib folder, and I'm off and running with this new version of jQuery. Now for this course, I'm not going to be using the Visual Studio Library Manager. We're just going to continue on using the scripts and content that were already installed by the project template when we created this application, just to keep things simple. But now you know about an approach that you can use to manage your own client-side libraries and your own applications. The template we use to set up our MVC application also set up bundling for client-side assets. Now, I do want to preface the following discussion by saying that if you're living in a world where your clients and your server are mostly using the HTTP2 protocol, bundling of client-side assets is not as important as it was in the days of HTTP 1.1 and 1.0. So IIS in Windows Server 2016 and later supports version 2 of the HTTP protocol, which has optimizations to make the downloading of client-side assets like JavaScript files and cascading style sheets a lot more efficient. This project is really set up for those clients or those servers that don't support HTTP2, because what it tries to do is bundle as many script files together as it can into a single download. In the past, that was more efficient than having, let's say, 5 script files that the browser had to download. We'd put them all 5, we'd bundle them together into a single download and also minify that file to make the download as small and as efficient as possible. It's not so much of a concern with HTTP2 these days. But if we go into the Views folder, into the Layout view, you'll see that we have these HTML helpers, styles, and scripts, which allow us to render the HTML elements that instruct the browser to download JavaScript files or to download cascading style sheets. We can see that when we run the application and look at the source code for the page that is produced. Let me right-click and actually do an inspect element, because I should see, if I scroll back up to the top of the page, inside of the head element, that we have a link to bootstrap.css. We have a link to site.css, which is the CSS file specific to the site. So Bootstrap is a library. Site.css is the file that we would modify to add custom styles to our application. And then there's a link to Modernizer. You typically want to load that at the top of the page, even though most JavaScript files, you want to load them at the bottom of the page or as late as possible. Modernizer is one of those libraries. If you take advantage of it, you want to load it as early in the page as possible. But down here at the bottom of the page, we can see we render scripts for jQuery and Bootstrap. And again, coming back to the layout page, if I scroll down, those script files are rendered because I have scripts.render, and you can see we want to render the bundle called jQuery. So what this is rendering are abstractions around our JavaScript files and our CSS files known as bundles. these bundles get configured. So if I look in bundle-config.cs, I should find where the Bootstrap bundle is configured and where the jQuery bundle is configured. So let's open up bundle config, and I can see jQuery is a script bundle that will include some version of jQuery. So this is telling the MVC framework, go into the scripts folder and look for jQuery dash and some version number. So it could be 3.3.1, which is what we currently have, or it could be 3.3.2. Essentially, this is trying to be very flexible as we move forward in the future and update our library. So if I drop a new version of jQuery into this folder, this software is smart enough to say, oh, you must want the latest version, which is 3.3.2. So I'm going to pick that up and put it into a bundle. These bundles can also detect if you're running in debug mode or release mode. And when you're running in release mode, that should be when you're in production. These bundles will make sure the files are minified and squished together, concatenated together. Right now, we just have one bundle for jQuery and one bundle for jQuery validation. A lot of people would take all those script files for both jQuery and the validation plugin and put them together into a single download. And then when I do a scripts.render on jQuery, the resulting file that comes into the browser would include both the jQuery library and jQuery validation. And in this API, you can see that there is a params argument to the include method, which means I can keep including as many strings here that point to as many files as I want. So I could go out and include jQuery and the validation plugin and Bootstrap all together into a single bundle. And then when I do a scripts.render on the bundle name, which is specified here, that would download the bundle of files that has been put together by the script bundler. We can also see there is a bundle for Bootstrap, and there's a bundle that includes bootstrap.css and our custom style sheet, sites.css. So that's a good example of where I place two files into a single bundle. It's just when I run in debug mode, the style bundler assumes I want to make things easy for debugging. So it doesn't actually concatenate files together. When I say in the layout view that I want to render content CSS, what styles.render will do is say, oh, inside of content/CSS, you wanted these two CSS files. Let me render individual link tags for those to make things a little easier for debugging. But if we switch over into production mode, which I'll show you the important setting and where to do that in web.config in the next module when we talk about deployment, when we switch over into release mode, there will be a single link tag emitted that points to a virtual file, you can think of it, that includes the contents of both bootstrap.css and site.css. That's efficient for the browser, especially if you're not using HTTP2. And now that we've covered bundling, let's dig into what jQuery validation provides. Inside the application, earlier in the course, we saw where we do have validation for creating and editing restaurants. So whenever we manipulate restaurant data, it's not legal to do something like have a restaurant that has no name. If I try to click save, I'll see that the name field is required. And actually there's a bit of a bug here in that I display the same validation error twice. Let's fix that really quick. If I come into the edit razor view, I'm pretty sure I know what this is. It's because I copy and pasted earlier in the course, which always leads to problems. But I copied and pasted all the markup to input the restaurant name and then pasted it and just modified name to cuisine, only I forgot that here in one location, which is the HTML helper that displays a validation message for. So we have validation, but this validation happens server side. In other words, when I click save, we have to send a request all the way to the server, process that request, find that the restaurant name is null or empty, and then send error messages back down to the browser. That's okay in many scenarios, but there's also some frameworks that make it very easy to do common validations on the client side. So something like having a required field is something I can implement using JavaScript on the client to make it fast and efficient. So as soon as I start typing here, that validation message should go away because obviously I'm providing a name. And if I don't have a name, and I click a button to post this form back to the server, the JavaScript can step in and prevent that post from going all the way back to the server. It can immediately display those validation error messages. And actually, ASP.NET MVC has everything set up to provide support for client-side validation. We're just missing one piece, which I'm going to show you in the next clip. But for right now, I just want to right-click on this input, say that I want to inspect this element, and you'll notice we do have an input whose type equals text, But notice all these attributes that start with data dash. So there's data dash validation equals true, or data dash val. There's data dash val dash max length, which seems to include the error message for what happens if I've exceeded the maximum length for a restaurant name. Notice there's the max length value, 255 characters. There's data dash val dash required, essentially saying this field is required, and here's the error message to display if this field is not populated. So all the metadata for client-side validation is in place. And where does that metadata come from? It comes from the HTML helpers. So when I say, please give me an editor for the model name, the editor for HTML helper can look at my model class, which is of type restaurant, and look at some of the data annotations that we have in place, like required and max length. It can then take the parameters for those types of validations and encode them into these data dash attributes. And then all we need is some JavaScript that can work with those data dash attributes. And that is the role of some of the validation libraries we have in here, specifically jQuery.validate, which is a plugin for jQuery to support client-side validation, and jQuery.validate.unobtrusive is a jQuery plugin provided by Microsoft to act as a bridge between these data dash attributes and the jQuery Validate plugin. So it's going to make the magic happen. So if I have jQuery and jQuery.validate and jQuery.validate.unobtrusive, all those scripts loaded onto a page, I should have client-side validation automatically. Let's look at how to enable that. Currently in the application, the Edit a Restaurant and Create a Restaurant features do not support client-side validation. And there's a simple explanation for that. When I created those features, I would add a view using the scaffolding tools in Visual Studio. So I would right-click a folder and say that I want to add a new view. And I would select a template, like the Edit template or the Create template, and I would select my model class. And then I would leave unchecked this checkbox to reference script libraries. It is this checkbox that will insert additional scripts into that particular Razor view, so that the client-side validation will work. And this will tie together a few things that we've been learning about. Let's go ahead and create an edit view, just named view. I'm only doing this temporarily. We're going to throw this view away, but I do want to select this checkbox and show you that there's really only one significant difference between this view that I just scaffolded and the other views that we're using for create and edit. And that difference is these additional 3 lines of code at the bottom of the view. This is defining a section named scripts. So you might remember from the last module when we talked about sections in a layout page. If I come over into our layout page, I will see down here at the very bottom of the page, the layout page tells the framework to render a section named scripts. It is an optional section, so not every view needs this section defined, but if it does exist, like it does on our new view, that section will allow us to render script tags down here at the bottom of the page after jQuery has been loaded and after Bootstrap. And it's important, if you're using a jQuery plugin, to load scripts in the proper order. So first I have to have a script tag that downloads jQuery and defines the jQuery object. And then I can load the plugins, and then I can load the plugins that depend on the plugin. So that's essentially what's happening with client-side validation. Load jQuery first, then load jQuery Validate, and then load jQuery.validate.unobtrusive that builds on top of those 2 previous libraries. And that's what render section will allow us to do. Specifically, we're going to render anything that was bundled into jQuery Val. And so tying things together from some of the things we've seen throughout this course, if we go back to bundle config, you'll notice the jQuery validation bundle includes jQuery.validate star, which allows us to pick up not only jQuery.validate.js, but also jQuery.validate.unobtrusive.js. And yes, again, the script bundler has some heuristics and is smart enough to detect that jQuery.validate.min.js is just the minified form of jQuery.validate.js, so it doesn't need to include both of those files. It's probably just going to take .validate.js and run its own minifier and then concatenate that together with jQuery.validate.unobtrusive when we are in release mode. And that is how ultimately we can support client-side validation, simply by making sure that we render that jQuery validation bundle. So let me take this section of scripts, I'm going to copy it, then I'm going to delete this view that we just created temporarily. So delete the view. And inside of edit.cshtml, I'm just going to scroll to the bottom and paste in the call to scripts.render. We can also use this in the create view. So if I scroll down to the bottom, I will paste that in here too. Let's save all the files. Let's do a build in the project just to make sure everything is starting from scratch. Let's come back and let's issue a GET request for /restaurant/edit/1. And I can now try to blank out the name of my restaurant and click save. And what we'll discover is that a request didn't reach the server that time. In this case, JavaScript was able to jump in and prevent that request from going to the server because the JavaScript is already detected there's going to be a validation error. And then as soon as I start typing, you'll notice that validation error message goes away. As soon as I remove that text, the validation error message reappears. So that's the jQuery Validate plugin operating with each keystroke to validate what is inside of this form. So all of your common validations, the length validations, the required validations, regular expressions, the range of numbers, all those simple types of validations are supported through data annotations in C# code, and also this client-side validation framework. If you have more complex validations, a lot of people ask me this question: how do I enforce complex validations, particularly business-type domain-oriented validations? Like VIP customers get to have this amount of discount, but only when the day is Thursday, those sorts of complex logical validations. Many times I tell people don't worry about trying to enforce them on the client side, but make sure you always enforce all of your validations on the server side. So even though we have client-side validation in place in this application, we still need to check model state and verify that we have valid models before we take any action on the server side, because it's very easy for people to circumvent client-side validation. So client-side validation provides a more interactive application. It can be a little bit quicker to respond for the user. But what if you want to go one step further and build a single-page application? Well, let's build one using a template inside of Visual Studio, and I'll give you an overview of what is happening inside. What I want to do in a new instance of Visual Studio is create a new project, so unrelated to the project we've been working on. It's going to be a brand new application, and it's still going to be a web application, but I want to use a different template when I create this application. So I still want a C# project that will run on Windows, so in other words, the .NET framework, and I still want to select this option to build an ASP.NET web application on the .NET framework. Let's click Next to move forward. I'll just leave the name as Web Application 2. The important part is here on this next screen where instead of selecting the MVC template, I want to select the option to build a single page application. We're just going to create this application quickly, and I'll show you a few features that are inside. It's going to take Visual Studio a moment to scaffold out this application. And what we're going to have is an application that's going to be a little bit different than the application we previously scaffolded at the beginning of this course. This application is going to include a framework to manage user identities. And this application, when I run it with Control F5 to run without the debugger, should immediately force me to register or log in. So this opened a web browser on a different monitor. Let me drag this over here where you can see it. We will once again go through this dialog that tells us we're working with a self-signed certificate. Are we sure we want to do this? I will say yes, accept this risk and continue onward. And when we enter the application, I'm immediately asked to log in. And that's because even the homepage of this application requires an authenticated user. So when ASP.NET sees I'm an anonymous user, it brings me to the login page. Since I do not have a login, I will need to register as a new user. Let me go ahead and fill in some details. So this is my email address. I'll just put down a hometown of Baltimore. I'm going to use my password manager to generate a password. This password includes uppercase, lowercase, digits, and symbols. That seems pretty good. So let's fill the password. I will update my password for localhost, and let's register for this application. And I am now logged in as scott@code.com. Perfect. I can see my homepage is now personalized. My hometown is Baltimore. And I can come over to this API page that shows me some documentation about an API that is available in this application. Specifically, there's an API at /API/me that will return my hometown. So this is where we were talking about the Web API, and the Web API works really well with single-page applications because typically what you're going to be doing in your single-page application is not retrieving HTML from the server. You're not going to be rendering Razor views. Instead, you're typically going to have some JavaScript on the client whether it's jQuery or Angular or Knockout.js or some other framework or library that you're using, and that JavaScript is going to make HTTP calls to your API controllers to get information or to post or put or delete information. And what we'll find on this home page is that most of this HTML is rendered just as static HTML, but this little bit that appears here, Baltimore, that's placed here through what we used to call an AJAX call. So we're using JavaScript to call back to the server, to call back to an API controller to say, who is this user and what is their hometown? So let's look inside the project just a bit. The first thing I want to point out is that we still have a collection of controllers, and now most of these controllers are the traditional controllers that we've been working with in our application. So controllers that derive from the system.web.mvc base controller class. So here's a home controller, here's a manage controller. This is the controller that allows me to manage my profile, which I can do if I come and click on my username up here, scott@oatco.com. I can change my password. But there's also, in this application, the me controller. So this controller doesn't necessarily have to be in an API folder, but you'll notice it is an API controller. And so it's a controller that I should be able to invoke from JavaScript, and it can return to me information that's either in XML or JSON format. So we'll notice if we scroll down here, if I issue a GET request to /API/me, this controller will use a component from the identity framework known as the user manager to find the current user. That will look me up in the database. So all that information is stored in the database and it's stored securely, so passwords are not in plain text. But this action will return a view model that includes my hometown, and that can be then placed into the screen. What does that look like from the client side? Well, let's look at the index view for the home page. And what we're going to see is that all this index view, all it really does is, first of all, render a partial view named _home, which will contain the HTML markup that we need for our home page. And then it's going to render some scripts. First, it's going to render a bundle for Knockout. Then it's going to render a bundle for the app. If you want to dig into exactly what is inside of those bundles, then you now know that you can look in the bundle config. What you're going to find is that Knockout is a JavaScript framework that offers client-side data binding and change detection, so it makes building a single-page application easier than just using something like jQuery or raw JavaScript. And then we also have a bundle for our application. What we're going to see if we look in the scripts folder is that there is an app folder, and this app bundle is basically going to include those files that are in the app folder. So this isn't a course on jQuery or JavaScript programming or Knockout.js. You'll find those courses on Pluralsight. I just want to point out that the core logic of this home page will be here inside of home.viewmodel.js. The real core behavior of this application happens right inside of here. But essentially, when the application loads up, we're going to use jQuery AJAX features to make an HTTP GET request to the user info URL, which is /API/me. We're also going to be passing along a bearer authorization header, which will identify the current user to the API. So that's simply an HTTP header that is authorization:bear and then an access token that's been granted by the identity system. And when that API call returns successfully, it's going to return some data, and we're going to update in the DOM on the page the text that displays your hometown is, and then place the data on the page. And ultimately what that will render is what we see here. Your hometown is Baltimore. So that's a quick overview of the single page application template that Visual Studio provides. Of course, these days you might be building sophisticated single page applications using Angular or Vue.js or React, and ASP.NET and ASP.NET MVC will support those frameworks also, and you can use a lot of the features and technologies that we've covered in this course to build those applications. And for all those types of applications, your API controllers become more important than your MVC controllers, because typically in single page applications, you're going to be making calls to the server. Your server is going to return data to your client-side application in JSON format, and then you're going to use your particular client-side framework, be it Angular or Vue or Knockout.js, to place that data onto the page at the appropriate location.